Welcome back into the Al Talmud teaching series, where we continue in the month of December here. We continue to work through our Christmas series, and specifically we're looking at right now is why Jesus was born. Let me restate for you. Almost very few people will argue that Jesus was born, but the question is, why was he born? So we're looking at the 5 elements, the 5 aspects, the 5 purposes, the 5 goals, as to why Jesus was born, okay? And here are the 5 things that we're looking at in this Christmas series here as to why Jesus was born. First of all, he came to be our substitute. Second, he came to be our salvation captain. Third, he came to be our sanctifier. Fourth, he came to be our Satan conqueror. And fifth, he came to be our sympathizing high priest. Now, that's what we've been looking at, and I want to ask you to open your Bibles to Hebrews chapter 2. Hebrews chapter 2. Let's read the entire text, verses 9 to 18. Hebrews chapter 2, verses 9 to 18. And then we're going to go back and park ourselves in verse 9. Now, based on what we did in our last teaching session, we will continue on number 2. That is that he came to be our salvation captain. So you need to go to the previous teachings to catch up as to where we are. But let's go into the text in Hebrews chapter 2, verses 9 to 18. And let me remind you, I'm reading out of the New American Standard Version of the Bible. So depending on what version you have, you just simply have to follow along. Let's read the text. But we do see him who was made for a little while lower than the angels, namely Jesus, because of the suffering of death, crowned with glory and honor, so that by the grace of God he might taste death for everyone. For it was fitting for him, for whom all things and through him all things, in bringing many sons to glory, to perfect the author of their salvation through sufferings. For both he who sanctifies and those who are sanctified are all from one Father, for which reason he is not ashamed to call them brethren, saying, I will proclaim your name to my brethren. In the midst of the congregation I will sing your praise. And again, I will put my trust in him. And again, behold, I and the children whom God has given me. Therefore, since the children share in flesh and blood, he himself likewise also partook of the same, that through the death he might render powerless him who had the power of death, that is, the devil, and might free those who through fear of death were subject to slavery all their lives. For surely he does not give help to angels, but he who gives help to the descendants of Abraham. Therefore he had to be made like his brethren in all things, so that he might become a merciful, faithful high priest in the things pertaining to God, to make propitiation for the sins of the people. For since he himself was tempted in that which he has suffered, he is able to come to the aid of those who are tempted. Now, if you just follow along in the reading, you will have noticed it comes right out of the text. Right? And we draw our outline, we draw our main points right out of the text. We don't impose our points on the text. We draw them out of the text. We allow the text to speak to us rather than we speaking into the text. So when I told you that he came to be our substitute, we draw this right out of the text in verse 9, and we can see this in when he says he is our salvation captain. We can clearly draw this out of the text. When we say that he's a sanctifier, we can draw this out of the text. He's the one who's come to defeat Satan. He could draw this out of the text, and he's come to be our high priest. We can draw this right out of the text. It's quite amazing to me that all year long we can seemingly be preaching out of the text, and for reasons I don't understand, when it comes to this season, this Christmas season, we kind of lose our minds and we go right back to a social, cultural, traditional messages with regard to Christmas itself, the idea of Christmas itself, and we seem to skirt around the main issue as to why Jesus was born. So I want to pick up where we left off, and when we continue under our second point, and that is that he is our salvation captain. And I've begun to give an explanation that in our last session. So let's continue with that. Let's go back to verse 9. Verse 9. Let's go back there because I want you to see this. He says, but he who did see him was made for a little while lower than the angels, namely Jesus, because of the suffering of the death, crowned with glory and honor, so that by the grace of God he might taste death for everyone. And then look at verse 10. For it was fitting for him whom all things and through him all things, in bringing many sons to the glory, to perfect the author of their salvation through sufferings. Now, we're now in verse 10. And we started this in our last session. It pleased him. Look at what the text is telling us. He said, it pleased him to make this captain perfect. Remember the word author, and depending on what version of the Bible that you have, if you remember this, and we were talking about this the last time, we mentioned that that in the New American Standard Version of the Bible, the word is author. In the King James Version of the Bible, the word is captain. In the New King James Version of the Bible, the word is captain. In the English Standard Version of the Bible, the ESV is founder. In the Amplified Version of the Bible, the word is going to be pioneer. In the Holman version of the Bible, it's going to be source. In the New Living Translation and in the Living Bible, it's going to be the perfect leader. And then in the Revised Standard Version of the Bible, it's going to be pioneer. So now, and the word, and really the word that we have chosen, and they're all accurate. It just depends on how you apply these words. But the one that we have chosen here is that he's the captain of our salvation. And if you recall, we spoke at great length as to what that word is. And in the Greek language is archegos, archegos, archegos. Okay? And that's the word that we've been working with here now. So it pleased him to make this captain, this author, okay, perfect. Why? So that he could blaze the trail into the Father's presence. This is what he's talking about. And bring along with him all of the sons that God had designed to enter into glory. So here we can see clearly the doctrine of election. We can see God's sovereignty as to he who's chosen is going to come into his presence forever and ever and ever. And so he is our perfect trailblazer. Let me ask you now go over to chapter 5 of the book of Hebrews. Chapter 5 of the book of Hebrews in verse 8. I want you to see this now. I want you to see this because it says that although he said, read the text first. He says, although he was a son, he learned obedience from the things which he suffered. Yeah, this is the Christmas story. Look at this. Although he were a son, he learned obedience from the things which he suffered. Watch this. And being made perfect, he became what? The author, the captain, or the archegos of eternal salvation unto all them that obey. So we can clearly see that Jesus is the perfect leader. Now remember, I told you this before, that he says, listen, the reason why Calvary happens is because Bethlehem happens. Okay? The reason why Jerusalem happens is because Bethlehem happens. And so if we don't have that, if we don't have what we call the Christmas story, we have the birth of the Lord and Savior Jesus Christ, then we don't have the rest of the package, which is eternal redemption, forgiveness, and salvation. So Jesus is the perfect leader, because remember, the Holy Spirit took 9 months to fashion a body to specifically prepare this body to die. And it wasn't just to be born, but it was to die. And it's through death. It's through death. He not only was the substitute, but a perfect leader, a perfect trailblazer, if you will. You say, well, what do you mean by that? What do you mean by that? Well, just this. There is no way to get to God apart from Jesus Christ. This is the reason why Christmas is the class. It is the exact representation of the doctrine of the incarnation, where God became man. Where, according to St. Augustine, if you remember, he says, the maker of men became a man. According to St. Augustine. It was a short phrase, it was a catchy phrase, but it was a concisely accurate phrase. Look, Jesus said, turn your Bibles to the Gospel of John. The Gospel of John in John 14, please. Go to the Gospel of John, John chapter 14, and look at this with me in verse 6. where Jesus says, he said, and he said, I am the way, I am the truth, and he says, I am the way and the truth and the life, and no one comes to the Father but through me. Now, look at the second half of that verse, because we always quote the first part, right? He says, I am the way, I'm the truth, and I am the life, right? Now, everybody seems to know that. It's the second half of verse 6 of John chapter 14 that becomes crucial for us to understand this. Look, he says, I am the way, no one cometh unto the Father, right? No one comes to the Father but through me. Excuse me, do you see that? But by or through me. There is no other way. And you see the way to God is blocked. Okay? How? How is it blocked? By sin. Okay? Is it not? Look, a man and his sin cannot just walk into God's presence. I don't care, you hear all these nonsense testimonies. We watch them on the internet, we watch them on Christian television, we hear them on Christian radio, we hear them on Christian podcasts, blah, 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 blah. And it's just pure, absolute nonsense. In fact, it's blasphemous. Okay? So, a man and his sin cannot just walk into God's presence, okay? No, impossible. Okay? We cannot enter into God's glory. We cannot get to heaven on our own merit. It's just not going to happen. Somebody has to blaze the trail for us. And this is exactly what Jesus Christ has done. Okay? And the only way to ever open up God's presence to us is to get rid of sin. Let's not get complicated about this. Sometimes we get so highfalutin in our theological language and vocabulary, and we forget to communicate something very simple and direct. Look, am I not right or am I wrong? Once sin is taken care of, we can then enter into his presence. Look, so Christ came for what reason? So that you could put him in, you can make a figurine out of him and put him in a manger under a Christmas tree. No. He came to die, to pay for our sin, and thus open up the trail so that we could enter into the presence of God. That's why he came. Okay? You see how he's a trailblazer. Okay? Look, and he had to die to do it. That was the whole purpose of his birth. Okay? Look at what he says. He was made perfect through what? Look, go back to Hebrews chapter 5, verse 8. Go back to Hebrews chapter 5, verse 8. Look at this with me. Look what he says. Okay? Look at it. He was made perfect through what? Suffering. Right? Hebrews chapter 5, verse 8 says, although he was a son, he learned obedience from the things which he suffered. There's no way. And listen to me. There's absolutely no way Jesus could arrive in the world and say, listen, everybody, listen up. Pay attention to me. Okay? Follow me. We're going to God. No. You cannot. There's no way you can go into the presence of God when there is unpunished sin. He became the perfect trailblazer. Okay? That's what you need to comprehend. Okay? He became the perfect captain, the perfect archekos. Okay? The perfect pioneer, the perfect leader, the perfect trailblazer. Whatever phrase you want to use. Okay? They're all accurate. Okay? And only that can only be accomplished how? By dying. By dying for us, he could open the path, and he opened it so wide. Okay? That so many sons could come to glory by following Jesus Christ. He paid for sin. Now, do you know something else? Do you realize, okay, that in 3 hours on the cross, okay, in 3 hours, Jesus paid the penalty of sin. Okay? That's going to take all the souls of all the ages and eternity. Okay? And they'll still never have it paid. Can you imagine it? What God could do sovereignly in 3 hours. It would take us all of eternity, and still we would not have it done. Did you know that? Do you know, okay, that people are going to spend eternity in hell? I'm talking about godless people, okay? Christless people, and an eternity in hell paying the penalty for sin. Do you know that Jesus Christ gathered up an eternity of punishment and paid it in full in 3 hours and walked away from it as the risen Savior? Now, that's power, okay? My friend, that's power. I don't know any other way how to say this, okay? That's absolute, pure, unadulterated power, okay? The cross was an absolute masterpiece. It was a masterpiece, and God exhibited a solution to the problem that no human intelligence could ever answer. In fact, no human religion could ever answer. The problem of how does God communicate mercy and grace to his sinful people? Now, how does he do that? Okay, well, if you think about this, okay, he brought mercy and justice together at the cross. That's what God did. At that cross, when Jesus hung, I'm thinking, he brought mercy and justice at that cross. And this is how he communicates this message, okay? Christ paid the what? He paid the penalty. He bore an eternity. Can you imagine this? Christ bore an eternity of judgment in 3 hours. That's beyond our finite minds to comprehend. And yet, he was not destroyed, okay? Oh, what a powerful person. Now, do you understand why the Holy Spirit took 9 months to prepare this body? Because it was not just a body of flesh and blood. Listen to me. And thus he became the perfect trailblazer, the perfect author of our salvation, the perfect captain of our salvation, the perfect archekos. He opened up the trail that we may follow him into the presence of God. Now, I remember reading some years ago about this Swiss patriot by the name, and he had a strange name, okay? And for those of you who know me, know I like to read a lot. I read a lot and like to read history, okay? Mainly I think, and I know where I got it from, okay? It didn't come from my little pea brain here, okay? I understood that, okay? But I got it because, my father, an interesting man, it's kind of interesting, the older I get, the more I understand him and the more I respect him, okay? And the more I appreciate him more and more and more and more, okay? But I remember as a child, my father would read a lot. Man, my father would read, okay? He read the newspaper, he watched the news, okay? But he would read books. He read books, okay? And there were times that, we would sit on the floor by the side of his bed as he was reading, and he talked to us, and he'd say things to us, okay? And I remember, I don't remember how we got started doing that, but I just remember doing that a lot, okay? And then my father would watch it in the very, very early days of, it was a program called Jeopardy, okay, on television. And the program was that you had to come up with the question, okay? And the answer. So there'd be the answers would be given, and then we get these questions, okay? And so much of this program in the early days, I'm talking about back in the 1960s, okay, that there would be a lot of history questions, okay? And I was always fascinated that I would sit there and watch this program. My father was, he was just a diehard fan of this program. And so we became diehard fans of the program, okay? But it was, I always sat there just amazed how my father would give an answer, and sure enough, the answer would come up, okay? Well, because, I really didn't capture it. I was too young to understand this, but I understood that he read. And he was very interested in, and so he was a reader, okay? Now, you wouldn't know it, okay? But he was a reader. My father was a reader, okay? And so it got me interested. Well, since I was a little boy, I've always read history, so I'm always reading history and pulling things out, okay? Well, I want to go back and talk about this guy. There was this Swiss patriot that I read about, and his name was Arnold Winkelried, Winklereed, Winkelried. It's a strange name, okay? Arnold Winkelried, okay? And Arnold, we'll learn, okay? We'll call him just Arnold, okay? Winkelried, okay? And if you go to Switzerland, okay? today. You'll see statues of Arnold because he's a very, very, very famous Swiss patriot. Okay? And Switzerland was a buffer state, much like Israel was a buffer state. Okay? Now, if you don't know anything about Israel, the Egyptians, the Assyrians, and the Syrians, okay, and the Jordanians, and you see all these countries around that surround Israel, they created Israel as a buffer state. So when they were going to have wars, okay, the two sides would come and meet in Israel to fight. Now, it's not their country, but they wouldn't fight on each other's country, okay? So they go to Israel. Well, it's the same thing happened to Switzerland. Okay, and for a long time, Switzerland was a buffer state. Okay, and it never really had any identity of its own, except that everybody in Europe who wanted to fight a war went over to Switzerland to fight it. Okay, and it's just, I always laugh because my brother-in-law Tony, he's a funny man. He's a very funny man. Okay, but he has his phrase. He says, "I'm sick of it." Okay, and I would just roar because. That's the state of where Switzerland had finally reached the point and said, Switzerland just said, "I'm sick of it." This country comes over here and this country comes over here and they want to come and have a fight, right? Well, look, and they just got tired. They got just tired of being a battlefield for everybody's armies. Right? Well, and the nations would be, as you know, in conflict, and they say, "Well, we'll meet on Switzerland on soil and have a war on this date." Okay, and they would march, and that's where they would have the war. Well, I want you to keep in mind the word archekos, okay? The trailblazer, the perfect leader, the pioneer, the captain, okay? Who leads a large group of people that are coming behind him. Well, keep that in mind for him, because that's the purpose of why I'm sharing this. Well, look. Well, as the Swiss people, they were a little tired. I mean, they just had it, okay? I think they must have heard my brother-in-law Tony. I'm just sick of it. We're tired of this. Okay? Well, so they decided that they were going to put up a resistance, the Swiss, okay? And there was this great army moving down from the north, and that they were coming from Germany, okay? And they used to march in a way that's called the Phalanx, P-H-A-L-A-N-A-X, okay? P-H-A-L-A-N-X, the Phalanx, okay? Which is about 1 mile or 2 miles long, and it's this long string of men, okay? And they would march shoulder to shoulder, okay? And the troops behind them, and the frontline men would have shields, okay? And then they would march through the mountains and through the valleys, okay, like a sidewinder, okay, across the mountains. So they would just literally march this way, okay, and it looked like a sidewinder snake. Okay, and they'd be coming down, okay. And this long string, okay, and all of the artillery, okay, and the things that are behind them, okay? And they came sweeping toward this village, while Arnold, okay, the Swiss patriot, okay, he gathered all the peasants, all the poor people together, okay, and they got together, okay, a Swiss army. They created their own Swiss army, and they decided that they were going to stop this army if they could. That's what they said. So they began to think about a strategy, okay? And they knew that there was only one way to do it, okay, and it was to break through the Phalanx, okay, and infiltrate it and destroy it from inside. So, as the army's coming down, okay, you can just imagine this is coming down. They're going to come down, and it's coming down like this, and they're going to come right in the middle of it and pierce it, which means that the army would have to collapse, okay, the opposing army would have to collapse in order to defend itself, okay? Well, and so as it approached this little village, they were gathered, okay, and they had pitchforks. That's what they had. They had pitchforks, okay, they had shovels, they had sticks, staves, and that was it. They didn't have any ammunition. They didn't have any armor. Okay, they didn't have any weapons. And so, as the Phalanx moved closer and closer to the village, Arnold, with a cry of glory to Switzerland, okay, he just started running by himself. Now, all the peasant armies behind him, and they watch this guy. He's shooting straight down. He's just shooting straight down at him, okay? Now, you can imagine the opposing German armies just looking at him. The one guy is coming at us, right? Well, and he ran right into the middle of that Phalanx, okay? And as he ran, I mean, he took into his chest, okay, all of these spears and okay, and he took the spears. Okay, I mean, can you imagine? And he's taking the arrows. I mean, he's taking everything into his body, and he keeps moving. Okay, and he made it. He broke through, but just a few yards until he collapsed, absolutely dead. Right on his heels, as the German army, okay, is watching this one lone man coming, okay, they didn't really capture the idea that right behind on his heels, okay, right on his heels, okay, not a yard behind was the whole Swiss peasant army, and they went in and they defeated this great European army and drove them back in one day. Okay. Now, it would have been an absolute tragedy, okay? An absolute tragedy, okay? If Arnold had run all the way, broken through the phalanx, phalanx, okay? And fallen dead, and all of the Swiss had been sitting back saying, oh my, what is Arnold doing? Man, the poor boy, he had a good heart. He did mean well, okay? But they were not on his heels. They were not following him. And you know something? Listen, my friend, Jesus Christ has done the same thing for every single one of us. He broke through the devil's stronghold. He ran right into the battalions of hell itself. Okay, he gathered all of the arrows and all of the spears and the wrath and the judgment of God could have sent at him. Okay, and he gathered up and he burst right through. And he also asked you to do the thing that he asked you to do is just follow him. Follow him. And claim the victory. Why? Because he is the perfect archekos. He is the captain of our salvation. He is the trailblazer. He blazed the trail. The victory is there. It's yours. It's absolutely yours. And we see how, number one, he is our substitute. And number two, he is our salvation captain. He became that because he died and he was born for absolutely no other reason. There is no other reason why he was born. Let me tell you something. He is our faithful substitute. He is our faithful captain. Okay, salvation. He is the archeko. He is the trailblazer. Because without him, we would have never been able to achieve what we were able to achieve by the mercy and the grace of God. And that is to win a victory that somebody else won for us. And that's in the person of Jesus Christ. Now, let me go back to Hebrews chapter 2. Hebrews chapter 2. Now, go back, and now we parked ourselves in verse 9. We parked ourselves in verse 10. And now we're going to park ourselves in verse 11 to 13. Verses 11 to 13. And we come to the third element, okay, of this Christmas story. And that is that, okay, and that is that he became our sanctifier. He became our sanctifier, okay? And this is absolutely, it is thrilling. Okay, and it blesses my heart. It should bless all of our heart. Okay, now, so here's the 13. In verses 11 to 13, he became our sanctifier. Now, let's open up. I'll go back to Hebrews chapter 2, and I want you to see this with me, verses 11, 12, and 13. For both he who sanctifies and those who are sanctified and are all from one Father, for which reason he is not ashamed to call them brethren. He says, saying, I will proclaim your name to my brethren in the midst of the congregation. I will sing your praise. And again, I will put my trust in him. And again, behold, I and the children, okay, whom God has given me. Look at verse 11. Look at the very first part of verse 11. He says, for both he who sanctifies, look at this, and those who are sanctified. He's our sanctifier. For both he who sanctifies, look at this in verse 11. That is Christ, that is talking about Christ, okay? He is the one who sanctified. Now, this seems like a monologue, and it's like Christ is talking about himself in the third person, okay? Sanctified. Do you know that word sanctify? It comes from the Greek word, okay, hagiazo, 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 and it means to make holy. It means to make holy, okay? And he that makes holy and they who are holy are all one, for which cause he is not ashamed to call them what? Brethren. That's absolutely amazing. God is not ashamed, Christ is not ashamed to call us brethren.